Hello, and welcome to another AP Computer Science video. Today I wanted to go through some key points and look at the rubric for the free response question from the 2019 AP exam that I signed this week. If you haven't yet tried that question on your own, please pause the video and go try that. You can access it from the remote learning folder on Schoology. If you have, let's go through my solution and some key points. This question was a class rating question, which means you had to write an entire class. And I think there's very likely to be a question like this on the AP exam this year, though it's much harder to predict. We have to write this entire step tracker class. They have told us that we need a constructor and then these following three methods here. What they didn't tell us is what instance variables we need. And you do need certain instance variables to make the methods work as intended. The way that you determine what instance variables you need is figure out what sort of information about state permanent variables that the class needs for the methods to run. For example, if we look at average steps, the average steps method, it says here, average steps returns the average number of steps per day calculated by dividing the total number of steps taken by the number of days tracked. So those two are perfect examples of things that definitely need to be instance variable. I need to keep track of at all times how many steps have been taken and also the number of days that have been input and tracked. And you'll note that these total steps and days tracked have both been listed as instance variables. The other two, this variable days active is required for the active days method, which needs to return the number of active days. That's something I need to keep track of in my class, and so it needs to be an instance variable. And finally, this add daily steps method, if we look at the comments in this section down here, every time they call add daily steps, it says too few steps to be considered active, or that this represents an active day. That variable is something that I need to keep track of. How many steps is required for it to be an active day, which was the 10,000 in this example. Once we determine what instance variables we need, the methods tend to write themselves. So I knew that I needed something to keep track of the step threshold, the number of days active, the total number of steps, and how many days total we've tracked. Then in my constructor, all you have to do is initialize those values. I initialize them in steps to the parameter that they input. Again, this 10,000 here that they input. And then days active, total steps, and days tracked all just need to start at 0, right? Then for each method, all you need to do, for instance, active days only needs to return the number of days active. Average steps does sort of the necessary division to calculate the average. And then add daily steps is just slightly more complicated. This is the method that for updating each of the values. So hopefully your solution looks a lot like this. You can check mine and compare, or check the rubric that we see in a second. But I do want to point out a few small things. First is that instance variables absolutely must be private, so make sure these are private. The next thing I want to point out is how we came up with these return types and parameters. It's in fact quite easy with these questions to do that. All I need to do is look at their example calls and the example return values. So let's go a method at a time and see what I mean. First, for the constructor. If I look at the constructor, it doesn't return any value because it's a constructor and it can't. And then if I see here, when they call the constructor, they've input this 10,000 to an int. So in my method header for the constructor, I better include an int as a parameter, and I did here, int active steps. What about add daily steps? Well, when they call add daily steps, it takes an integer as a parameter. So I need an integer parameter here, and it returns nothing. This return value is blank, and so I need my return value type should be void. What about active days? Well, active days takes no parameters, and returns an int. I need to return an int. And then finally, average steps, no parameters. It returns a double, so my return type is double. So these method headers, which by the way are worth 3 out of the 9 points on the problem, come for free from just looking at the examples and copying exactly how they use them. They tell you what the return type should be by showing what it returns, and they tell you what the parameters should be by showing what the parameter list is. Now that we've seen my solution, Hopefully you had a second to understand it. If not, take a second to pause and compare to yours. I want to go show you the rubric and some of the small things and then how we would read the rubric to check answers in the future. So here on Google, I'm going to search AP Computer Science A free response questions. Anything like this will work. And the first result that pop up should be this College Board AP Central website. It's going to look a little awkward here because my window is small, but hopefully you can figure it out. We scroll past some things about the exam, which are totally wrong now, down to this free response question, free response, etc. And here I see 2019 free response questions. So this question was from 2019, so this will be perfect for us, but we can also click on this and it'll show the same sort of box for every exam 2018 before, literally every AP Computer Science exam ever given. If I click on this link, it'll just open up a link to all the free response questions as you would see them on the test. We don't care about that for now. What we care about is scoring guidelines, scoring guidelines, and also perhaps sample responses. The rest are statistics and commentary that are probably less useful to us. So let's open scoring guidelines. It takes us to a PDF. We're going to skip question 1 and scroll down to question 2. So here's question 2, step tracker. Let's see what we would have gotten points for. +1 declares all appropriate private instance variables. So we got 1 point for this, noting that they had to be private instance variables. All right, 2 points for the constructor, which is broken down to a point for the header, public step tracker int, whatever, getting the header just like this. And then +1 for using this parameter and the appropriate values to initialize these variables. So now we're up to 3 points. 3 points for the add daily steps method. 1 point for the header, 1 point for identifying whether a day is inactive, so this chunk right here, and then 1 point for updating these 2 instance variables. Up to 6, 1 point for active days method, just for the entire thing, getting both the header and returning the right value, and then 2 points for average steps, 1 point for the header, and 1 point for calculating the double average number of steps. Note this has to be a double. You would lose the point if you forgot this double and calculated an int average. So this is the points you get. If I were grading an AP exam, or if I'm grading your free response question on a test, you use this sort of rubric to determine points. We got a 9 out of 9. If you missed one of these things, maybe you got an 8 or a 7, you can calculate your own score, what it would have been on an AP exam. We also have some more detailed scoring guidelines though. For each point, they show what it requires, and this is just what it said in the rubric above. And then some things you will get the points even if you maybe messed up or did a little bit different from their idea. And then some things that would lose you points. So for instance, for the header for step tracker, even if we just omit public and don't say it at all, we'll still get the point, but we will not earn the point if we declare it private. Take a second to read these or go look them up yourself. But this constructor, for instance, if we don't declare instance variables, if we initialize local variables instead of instance variables, if we do some wrong things with parameters, we lose the point. Lots of things that may or may not be applicable. One thing I did want to note in this is that in the average steps, you'll note that I have the case where if my days track to 0, return 0.0 to avoid the case where they ask for the average steps and get a divide by 0 error here. You will note that responses earn the point even if they fail to handle the special case where no days are tracked. So if I had forgotten this and not included this at all, I'd still get the full point. They would not take points off that. You would, unfortunately, lose a point if you use integer division, so if I miss this double, or if you calculate it wrong, or if you calculate it and then don't return it. So here's all the things you would get points for, here's all the things you would lose points for, and general penalties. And then below that, they show sort of a canonical solution, a full credit solution that the writers of the question had in mind when they wrote the question. So this is a good place to look to compare your answers. It's very similar to mine, but for future questions, this might be useful. So when we're doing AP exams, AP free response questions, it's a great idea to take a look at these after you've tried, look through their sample solution, look through what points you would have gotten and giving yourself a score. I highly encourage you to give yourself a score for this question right here. see how you did, see what you could have corrected, and maybe small, silly things that you would have lost points for that you should fix in the future. That's it for today. See you guys next week sometime, hopefully, and have a good weekend.